Welcome to Moving from Lament to Hope, Engaging the Psalms in the Time of Pandemic. This webinar is hosted by Andhra Christian Theological College in Hyderabad, Telangana, India, and Union Presbyterian Seminary in the United States, now offering the new Master of Arts in Public Theology degree program. Are you called to be a Christian leader in the public square? Know someone considering theological education? Contact our admissions directors at admissions@upsem.edu. Our panelists are Reverend Joseph Premvardhan, lecturer in Hebrew Bible at Andhra Christian Theological College, and Dr. Samuel Adams, professor of Bible and Old Testament at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Our host and moderator is Dr. James Taneti, assistant professor of World Christianity and director of the Syngman Rhee Global Mission Center for Christian Education, also at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Dr. Taneti, the floor is yours.
Good morning to those in the US and evening to those in India. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us to this session again. And this week we'll be engaging the Psalms in the context of COVID-19. As you know, the reference last time has been to, but not confined to, India. And we've been dealing with many viruses, some new ones. COVID is just one of them. But let me sum up what's happening there in 3 sentences that I heard this week. Someone said, by the rivers of XYZ, we sat and we saw the dead bodies float. They ask us to celebrate. What is there to celebrate? Another friend said, with each death, a part of me has been stolen away. And another one said, James, this is relentless, incessant. We have no time even to bid farewell and to grieve our losses. With no further comments on what's happening there about the context, as they've been already welcomed, let me introduce the panel. And by the way, I do want to acknowledge that there is this gender imbalance. I tried my best, but we got the best that we have from both seminaries. And thank you, ACTC, Andhra Christian Theological College, for partnering with us. And thank you, Reverend Joseph Premvardhan, for responding to the paper presentation by my colleague, Dr. Sam Adams. And thank you, each of you, for returning back or joining us for the first time at this conversation. Last week, we had a rich conversation, and I'm hopeful that we will have another rich conversation. Appreciate your commitment to learning and leading. And now over to my colleague, Dr. Samuel L. Adams.
Thank you so much, James. And really delighted to be with everyone this morning. It's a privilege and an honor to be with colleagues at United Theological College, at ACTC in Hyderabad, and with others who are watching, whether in India or among some of our other wonderful partners elsewhere in the world, and for any watching here who are in the US and affiliated with Union Presbyterian Seminary. I do want to spend a couple of minutes this morning reflecting with you on the book of Psalms, the language of lament, the language of hope and assurance, in which the Psalter also engages. But I wanted to just say special words of appreciation and prayer and solidarity with so many dear friends in India. Some of you may know that I have spent about 2 years of my life in India. I first studied in India as an undergraduate at Madras Christian College as on an exchange program back in 1992. Then I was able to come back a few years later, and I taught English, spoken English, American literature, and other classes at Bishop Heber College in Trichy in Tamil Nadu, and did that for a year. And I'm privileged now to be able to bring groups from Union Presbyterian Seminary to engage in fellowship, in building church and theological college partnerships with many of you. James and I were fortunate and blessed to be able to spend time at UTC over the last few years, to spend time at ACTC only a couple of years ago, and was able to spend time with Premvardhan and many of the other faculty and students. We were overwhelmed by your generosity, your hospitality, the wonderful fellowship, and I have to also say the wonderful food that you always grace us with. The food is always incredible. So just heartfelt prayers for you during this very difficult time that is truly unfathomable, what you're having to deal with. The pandemic has been so difficult everywhere, but special prayers and hopes for a new day in India in terms of turning the page from COVID-19. So I want to talk for a minute about the Psalms. And in one respect, it's noteworthy how little pastors and churches engage the Old Testament in many cases, and particularly the language of lament. When pastors preach the Old Testament, it's often or usually just a select group of passages, often read in conjunction with the New Testament, rather than the full range of biblical material. And the Psalms give us a vocabulary for what it means to be human, to experience grief, to come before God with our sorrows and problems, and to ask questions about why certain things are allowed to happen. One of my predecessors at Union, Sibley Towner, has looked at the ways in which the Psalms are preached in the lectionary, where they show up in the lectionary, how often the Psalms have been preached. And one of the things he notices is our tendency in churches to sanitize the Psalms, to avoid the language of tragedy, to avoid the language of lament, to avoid the language of anguish and trauma. In other words, to try to tie the Psalms up with a bow and to make them seem perhaps a little less human than they actually are. And what I mean by human is that the Psalms give us a framework for approaching tragedy, approaching God in the midst of something like the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the Psalms offer detailed descriptions of what it feels like to be sick, to be hopeless, to even feel like you don't exist in the world. With a few turns of phrase, the psalmist gives terrifying portraits of illness and isolation, and how illness and isolation can affect someone's well-being. Difficult experiences can leave someone in a shattered state, a mental place where all friends have become foes and even casual acquaintances are hostile. Such a predicament confronts the speaker in Psalm 31. And if you want to turn to Psalm 31 in your Bible, please do so. I'm going to read just about 5 or 6 verses from Psalm 31, starting in verse 9. So this is Psalm 31, verse 9. Be gracious to me, Lord, for I am in distress. My eye wastes away from grief, my soul and my body also. For my life is spent with sorrow and my years with sighing. My strength fails because of my misery and my bones waste away. I am the scorn of all my adversaries, a horror to my neighbors, an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me on the street flee from me. I've passed out of mind like one who is dead. I've become like a broken vessel. For I hear the whispering of many, terror all around, as they scheme together against me, as they plot to take my life. And then notice verse 14, but, this is one of the biggest buts in the entire Bible. But I trust in you, O Lord. I say you are my God. My times are in your hand. Deliver me from the hands of my enemies and persecutors. Let your face shine upon your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. So if we think about Psalm 39, this can be classified as a lament or a complaint from a specific individual. Such complaints or laments frequently occur within the context of a prayer of supplication. And in Psalm 31, the prayer extends from verses 2 all the way through 19. This particular section, verses 9 through 16, they convey a crisis in all facets of a person's existence, including mental problems and the failure of important faculties. Notice the verse, I am in distress. My eye wastes away from grief, my soul and my body also. The psalmist doesn't tell us the events that led to such a desperate situation. And the decision to leave out this information is probably intentional. By describing the powerful emotions, the speaker likens himself to a deceased person in verse 12 and not giving us the specific context. The psalmist allows the audience to apply these feelings of isolation and helplessness to any number of situations. In this respect, the language of trauma in Psalm 31 is flexible and can be transferred to a variety of contexts, including the trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic. Similar expressions of helplessness and trauma can be found in other writings of the Old Testament, especially the book of Jeremiah. This prophet of the 7th century BCE describes an atmosphere of rampant hostility where terror is all around. Notice this same phrase, terror is all around, appears in Psalm 31:13. Jeremiah lived during a period of turmoil, instability, and exile, and he endured intense persecution at the hands of his enemies. The language of Psalm 31 conveys a similar level of anxiety. I hear the whispering of many in verse 13, even if the precise circumstances are not clarified. So we see in Psalm 31 that physical illness and the despair of forced solitude have brought the speaker in this psalm to a pitiful state. It is noteworthy that grief has caused the eyesight to fail, and the passing of years has been characterized by sorrow and misery in verse 10. As we think about this psalm and this language in the midst of the pandemic, it's worth noting how the loss of our loved ones and all the challenges we have faced has been accompanied by social isolation. We don't get to see friends and family and enjoy life celebrations. I know in India, this is a great loss. One of my favorite things about being in India is how much you value birthdays, baptisms, weddings, and other important rites of passage. Those celebrations really matter, and when you don't get to experience them, they can lead to feelings of helplessness. Returning to the psalm, it's possible that health challenges have contributed to the psalmist's poor physical appearance and social isolation. The psalmist feels like the world is closing in on him. They scheme together against me in verse 13. In the next set of verses, the discussion moves from the failure of the physical body to the sting of social rejection. Fellow human beings are arrayed against the individual uttering this prayer, and there's nowhere to turn for assistance. The prayer conveys a scene of complete isolation. I am the scorn of all my adversaries, a horror to my neighbors, an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street flee from me. The last phrase emphasizes the comprehensive nature of this situation. Even the casual person on the street will cross in order to avoid any contact with the person in question. Such a mob mentality understandably threatens the self-esteem of the individual making this plea. Since terror is all around, it becomes impossible for the marginalized person to find a compass point and an accurate sense of self. In a similar fashion, the language of verses 12 to 13 describes a human being burdened by depression and paranoia. The figure in this prayer has become, for all practical purposes, dead. A broken vessel is what the psalmist tells us, with a lack of perspective on life. This section reaches a crescendo as the world closes in on the unfortunate soul who seems to lack any sort of escape from a desperate situation. I think this type of desperation and the way it's expressed in Psalm 31 is so applicable for our current context, especially for our brothers and sisters in India, as you have endured the loss of so many friends, but also the sense that the world is closing in on you and there's nowhere to turn for help. These feelings of despondency, of trauma occur in other Psalms, and too often in our preaching and teaching, we don't pay sufficient attention to them and acknowledge the fact that suffering and trauma are a part of the human situation. The language of suffering lurks at every corner. As William P. Brown argues, the threat of death is ever present, constricting and afflicting human livelihood and existence. For example, Psalm 69:2, I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I've come into deep waters and the flood sweeps over me. Or Psalm 88, the soul of my soul is full of troubles. My life draws near to Sheol. I'm counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Now, one of the fundamental questions we have to ask about these psalms, these lament psalms, which are, by the way, the most common psalm that we find in the Psalter. This is the most frequent genre in the book of Psalms. Does this lead to despondency and hopelessness? The answer is a resounding no. Even in the midst of sorrow and illness, these lament psalms move confidently in the direction of hope. The Old Testament contains a number of passages in which a simple but does not convey the force of the Hebrew that we find in the text. We don't pay enough attention to conjunctions as a part of speech. We don't pay enough attention to conjunctions that transition the language of a particular text in a decidedly new direction. Psalm 31:14 is one such example. The first word in this verse is known as an adversative conjunction, meaning that what follows will contrast greatly with what went before it. It should really be translated with but, capital B, capital U, capital T. The prayer turns from complaint to petition for God's justice and mercy. But I trust in you, O Lord. The tone of the psalm shifts from lifeless despair to hopefulness. As the desperate individual places complete confidence in the Lord, the remaining days of life, my times, are handed over to God, and this signifies a decisive break from what we saw in the earlier sections, the previous state of sickness and isolation. In verse 16, the supplicant, the psalmist, seeks wholeness in God's love. Let your face shine upon your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. The subsequent verses of Psalm 31 confirm that the person offering the prayer is rescued and that all who are suffering should be similarly patient for wondrous displays of God's steadfast love, God's hesed. The description of suffering in this psalm has become associated in the Christian context with the final dark days of Jesus' life, which were characterized by intense physical pain and social rejection. Like Psalm 31, 9-16, difficult circumstances escalate in the passion narrative as Jesus faces an agonizing journey. Like Jesus, this individual in the psalm is willing to endure the harshest course imaginable while persisting in loyalty to God. Such sacrifice can then serve as a model for others. The timeless account of persecution in this prayer demonstrates how difficult it can be to remain faithful when one feels completely rejected and without physical vigor. It shows us how difficult it can be to remain faithful when one feels completely rejected and without physical vigor. And I don't say this just in the context of thinking about the COVID pandemic, but also the many ways I have been enriched by Dalit theology in India and what it is like to maintain faith, to maintain one's hope and trust in the Lord in the face of social persecution. I've been so inspired at ACTC and other places by listening to my brothers and sisters who speak from the language of what it means to be a Dalit in India. The Psalms give us a real sense of hope and purpose with this but I trust in you, O Lord. Our days and seasons are in God's hands, and we remember that we trust in the Lord, but we also remember in the words of Psalm 30 that weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning. I want to turn to my friend and colleague, Dr. Premvardhan, but I also want to offer a prayer based on these lament psalms before I finish my remarks. Please join me. Oh God, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, the source of all that is and the destiny of everything that exists. We give you thanks for bringing us together for this time today as we mourn and lament the pain we have suffered in the past months. Enfold us in your loving arms. As we move with hope and determination into the days to come, fill us with your power. Give us eyes to see what you would have us do and the wisdom and the will to do it. Help us to maintain our trust in you in the midst of this pandemic and to remember that the light shines in the darkness and that while weeping may linger for the night, joy comes in the morning. Amen. Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to some conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Of course, I'll reserve my comments till the end, but it's your turn, Reverend Joseph Premvardhan, to make a response to my colleague, Dr. Adams.
Yeah, greetings to you all in the precious name of our Lord Jesus. And it's a great opportunity for me in this to be a part in this thought-provoking program. So firstly, I would like to say thanks to James Elisha Taneti, sir, for giving me an opportunity to be a part in this program and keeping faith in me to respond this wonderful paper presentation. I also acknowledge the very presence of a Jain scholar in the Old Testament, respected Samuel L. Adams, sir. It's really amazing for me to share my thoughts with great scholar, and it remains as unforgettable incident in my life. Firstly, I would like to say regarding for the confusion over the emergence of coronavirus in the world. Most of us believe that it came out from Wuhan lab, that is from China. And further, it is open that it is a kind of biological war for world political and economic power. On the other hand, it is also open that the virus is evolved from the natural process of evolution. So, however, despite to the fact, virus left its impact not only just physical, and it brought all ill effect over the socio-political situations in India. So most of the Indian intellectuals are expressing their opinions as failure of Indian political as well as the medical system as the main reasons for the spread of virus and loss of many loved ones in their families. So in addition, the coronavirus brought grave-like situations in human relations as well. I have read one article entitled like Stigma and Discrimination in the COVID-19 Pandemic, written by Divya Banot, Tushar Singh, Sunil K. Verma, and Shivanka Sheth. So these open that that is happening. What exactly happening in Indian society during this pandemic? Particularly in Northeast Indians, as known Chinkies, when people used to call them Chinkies, who have traces from Mongolian race, are stigmatized and being treated as enemies because they resemble Chinese. That means we can observe that racism has taken place in these times of pandemic. In addition, BJP party, the ruling party, is well known to the Hindutva movement associated to Hindu philosophy. So some people are propagating, some politicians and leaders are propagating to drink gomutra, that means urine of cow, can eradicate the coronavirus, and taking bath at Kumbh Mela. It's a bathing ritual at a river confluence of Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, where they believe that the entire coronavirus will be moved away by taking a ritual bath. So further, Indian government is not ready to announce complete lockdown because of the fear of the fall of Indian economy, and also the privatization of medical system created unwanted shortage of oxygen cylinders and hike of medical expenses in corporate hospitals. So these many reasons have created confusion and loneliness in each one in India, and also caused to evoke many realities which has its roots for a long time. In addition, it can also be noted that many of the lower class workers are forced to live by the daily wages, but the pandemic situation made them to lose their jobs, and their family survival has left them in confusion. But many people who live under the below poverty are stigmatized and called as a barrier of coronavirus. In addition, religious discrimination also brought in front due to Tabligh Jamaat incident, which is a Muslim missionary organization. And these Muslims were stigmatized to spread as a corona terrorism. These are the grave-like situations in India in the pandemic situation. So therefore, I would like to bring to your notice of grave realities, and I acknowledge the presentation of Dr. Samuel L. Adams as its eye-opening findings from the Lament Psalms, Lament Psalm that is from 31 and as well the 39, which is more relevant to the Indians in this pandemic. So especially when I go through your paper and I found that the Psalm 39 is more relevant, because in Psalm 39, verse 10 refers to pestilence. It is used in Hebrew, naga, which means a pestilence. And pestilence is exactly refers to the situation of the isolation of the people. And I have gone through some article, and I'm remembering that the illness, it is open that illness is not personal in ancient times, and it is believed that due to failure of socio-political systems are the reasons for the evocation of these pandemics. So most of the Psalms have same genre in Lament Psalms, but the core content would be the same as complaint, trust in God, and woe and praise. So Gerald T. Shepard writes in his article entitled "Enemies and the Politics of Prayer in the Book of Psalms," quotes the statement of Norman K. Gottwald, is that all the Psalms have a socio-political background and finally became literary products in the lectionary in ancient Israel. So, however, the ancient Israelites have also have the history of epidemics in their salvation history. Most of the scholars opine that the emergence of the 10 plagues in the Exodus story are the epidemics due to political policies and abuse environmental policies of the Egyptians. So God liberated and saved them for the terrible epidemics and made them to follow many health instructions later in their social life. So, and later we found that epidemic situation in the book of Lamentations, chapter 1, verse 20, which was caused due to the policies of Babylon as well as Judah. So here I would like to bring my insight that spreading of corona may be due to the policies of socio-political regions of the state, but people are not left by God because God is faithful for his people and loyal to his covenant, which has made them, which has made at the time of Noah. If we observe in the book of Genesis, chapter 8, verses from 21 to 22, God himself have made a covenant of sustenance of the creation. So there God states that God is not going to punish the entire creation because of the human sin. So it is a covenant of God. So God has made covenant, and it is believed in the Psalms, especially in this Lament Psalms, is more loyal to his covenant. And most of the Psalms, Lament Psalms have a normal argument with the God that how long and why, these are the questions. So, but many of the scholars opines that these are the questions regarding the loyalty of God. That means in the Hebrew, the words like hesed, that means the faithfulness of God or steadfast love of God. And it is also related to the Hebrew word like imuna and sedek. So the three words are interrelated, which causes to the people, those who are in isolation, probably they have trust due to this covenant loyalty of God. So finally, what I would like to bring is God is more faithful, and we have trust in God. And due to the policies of this state politics and as well as their policies, which may have left the people live lonely situations. But church has that opportunity. From the scriptures, it is stating that God is more loyal to his covenant, and one day we will overcome all these grave-like situations and from the loneliness. So thank you very much for giving this opportunity, James sir, and as well, I'm very thankful to respond, Samuel L. Adams sir, for giving this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Premvardhan. Of course, Dr. Adams for capturing the moment and interpreting Psalm 31, and Dr. Premvardhan for explaining the trauma there and bringing into focus Psalm 39. It's an opportunity, Dr. Adams, for you to respond to the presentation that Premvardhan made.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Dr. Premvardhan. Appreciate your creative and passionate remarks. I think just a couple of things. One of the issues you're speaking to is the social structures that are often in place that are oppressive, that work against making progress when something like a pandemic happens. And I think that's a really important point that, you'd mentioned some of the both government policies, some of the mistakes that have been made. And I think in the Psalms and in the prophets, especially Jeremiah, there's lots of references to the fact that sin and hopelessness can really be present when there's dysfunction at the larger societal level, and that this exacerbates, this creates even greater tragedy when something like a pandemic happens. And you're quite right that I was reading yesterday that in the social world of the Bible, it's important to remember that most people didn't live beyond their 30s or their 40s. They were quite used to pestilence. They were quite used to disease. The infant mortality rate was as high as 50%. So they are writing from a place of constant trauma and difficulty. So the the language of lament that we find in the book of Psalms is it wasn't just theoretical for them. It was something that they knew and that they spoke as part of what they felt of what it means to be human and what it means to be a person of faith. I just want to come back to a point I said, 2 points that I made earlier, and then I think we have at least one question. But the first one is that that we too often gloss over the language of lament in the Psalms, and that we would rather land on more hopeful passages, on more passages that speak to times of goodness and mercy, and those are certainly plentiful in the Bible as well. But when we encounter trauma, tragedy, and something like we're encountering now, we really do have to reside a bit. And by doing so, it provides us with courage to be honest about what it is that we're facing. It provides us a framework in which we can be courageous and steadfast in our belief in God. Premvardhan mentioned Hesed, faithfulness. The repeated iteration in the psalm that God's steadfast love endures forever. So I think that's absolutely important. And again, we have to pay attention to the buts. Pay attention to the conjunctions we find in the Psalter. But I trust in you. I just think that's so key. I would like to say we're getting some good questions from Old Testament scholars in both India and pastors as well, both in India and the United States. We have some real experts on the Psalms who are part of this webinar. So I feel like I am grateful for their presence with us. And if anybody has any additional questions they want to ask, please ask them in the chat. But James, do you want to start addressing some of the questions that are coming across, we can
appreciate that opportunity. One is from Hebrew Bible scholar from ACTC, Reverend Premvardhan's colleague, who is asking, of course, he is thanking you for the presentation and asking, can we also say that the language of lament carries the tone of courage to embrace pain and pathos? So how are lament and courage related? That's his question.
And it's a really good one. We do have again, what I would argue is some of the most intense existential longing and as Jiva says, the courage to embrace pain and pathos in the face of isolation and helplessness. None more striking than the first verse of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? It takes great courage as Jiva says, in the face of isolation and helplessness, to argue or to ask the question, to feel that the speaker in this psalm is feeling so isolated that the psalmist feels forsaken by God. Notice again, and obviously this is a famous psalm, not just in its original context, but because of the way it is invoked and cited in the Synoptic Gospels. But notice again, even in Psalm 22, you get, but you, O Lord, do not be far away. O my help, come quickly to my aid. We have a but even in Psalm 22. We have that adversative conjunction. In Psalm 22 and Psalm 31 and Psalm 39, which Premvardhan mentioned, in all of those places, you have, I would absolutely agree, you have real courage that embraces pain and pathos in the face of isolation and helplessness. And in that sense, I would argue we are given permission to carry to God in prayer our feelings of isolation and helplessness, and that's a hard thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do, I would argue. So I think Jiva really does ask a really good question. I don't know, Premvardhan, do you want to speak to that?
Okay, I think he's muted, but I think this should do. And if I stretch it further, Dr. Adams, that only those with hope lament. Those who are numb to hope cease to lament, and those who cease to lament are numb to hope. Am I stretching it further than what the psalmist believes?
No, I think that's exactly right. Well, William Brown talks about a continuum between hopelessness and trust, and we're always on the journey between hopelessness and trust and confidence. It's never, it's always moving, and especially when we're in the midst of a traumatic situation, it can be very difficult to move in the directions of confidence and trust. But the psalmist, the Psalms remind us repeatedly that God's steadfast love endures forever. There was a comment from one of our distinguished alums at UP-Sim, who's a pastor in Florida, who makes a really good point. And this was something I meant to say earlier. This is from Charles Freeman. He says, a comment that preaching from the Psalms, even especially the Lament Psalms, is all the more amplified by also singing from those Psalms. That's absolutely true. The Psalms, one of the things that is undoubtedly the case is that the Psalms were sung in ancient worship in ancient Israel. That it seems very clear that there was call and response, and that that there was both collective and singing of solos in terms of how the Psalms were uttered in the ancient context. We have lots of examples, and I could go into sort of an academic discussion as to why this is the case. But I want to come back to one of my predecessors at the seminary, Sibley Towner. He did an experiment a few years ago. This gets at Charles's question. He went and looked at all the worship books, including the Presbyterian hymnal, the Methodist hymnal, and the ways in which the Psalms are included in terms of singing. And one of the things he noticed is that whoever put the hymnals together took out most of the lament language. Even within Psalms that, like Psalm 31, if you go and look at the Presbyterian hymnal, a lot of the language I read this morning is removed or changed or sanitized. And so in other words, we put a happier or more upbeat framework for not just preaching the Psalms, but singing the Psalms. And one of the things that Dr. Towner noted in that is that something is lost when we do that. It's not to say that worship should always be gloomy, that worship should be hopeless. That's not the point. But the Lament Psalms give us a framework for moments like this. And by changing hymnals, by not sort of reflecting the full range and scope of the Psalter, we're not capturing all the theological and ethical beauty of what we find in the book of Psalms. So I think that's a really good and important point. We do have some other questions coming across. James, do you want to field those?
Yeah, one question that I have for Reverend Premvardhan related to what Charles Freeman has asked. How often, of course, you are a minister in the Church of South India. How often in your hymn book or in the songs that you sing in your worship, do you hear the songs of lament, especially drawn from the Psalm of Lament? You need to unmute, please.
Yeah. Actually, not specific. The use of Psalms, Lament Psalms, but we have a tradition of following the Lament hymnals at the period of this 40 days of, in lectionary we'll get that 40 days. What would I would like to? I forgot that. Lenten days. Yeah, Lenten days. Lenten days, we follow that hymnal songs, songs regarding the sufferings of Jesus over the cross. And not in particular, but now in this context of pandemic, and recently our bishop has organized one prayer all through the pastors through Zoom meeting, which was very innovative. And there they started finding out related psalms and related songs in these pandemic situations, but not in particular.
Thank you. That helps knowing how does our culture or how do our cultures deal with lament. I'll come back to those questions, another related question later. But we have a counselor right within our community, UPSM community, asking a question from Charlotte, North Carolina, Jennifer Kaminsky, who is asking about the healing value, the therapeutic utility of healing function of expressing our laments, inviting God into our pain to transform that pain, sometimes by borrowing words from psalmists, also by encouraging people to write their own. I think she put it more eloquently than I would. Would you please respond to that, Dr. Adams?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that, we can think of so much language in the Psalms that, speaks to people. And there's really some interesting work being done. And as a counselor, she would have a lot more experience with this than I am. But a lot of people are applying trauma theory, are applying some of the language that is learned in the world of counseling and education for becoming a counselor to the language in the Psalms. That's a really new and exciting direction that a lot of people are going. So you do have this language of comfort, of God providing comfort, and I think that's important. That would be obviously quite famous in Psalm 23. That God is with us, that God comforts us. The Hebrew there of Naham, of God providing, of God being a comforter. Premvardhan had mentioned the Book of Lamentations and some of the other psalms that involve lament, that where there doesn't seem to be a comforter, but there is always the movement in the Book of Psalms towards the language of comfort. I would point out in that regard as well that there is the Psalms also speak to our greatest task in life. When we're confronted with the question, when we look at Scripture, as to what is the thing that brings us the most joy in life, and what is our most fundamental task during our few earthly days, according to the Book of Psalms, and that is to praise God. That is the thing that can bring us the most joy, and that's the most important thing we can do. It's also really important to note that the Psalms move and conclude with praise and affirmation. That the last 5 books of the Psalter, speak to the need to praise God for God's wondrous works, and that in a sense, this is a transformative act. That as we move from existential grief, from trauma, from illness and disease, that our greatest task and our source of greatest joy is to praise God. I just finished reading with my students in Hebrew Psalm 146, and we don't have time to read it today, but to answer that question, the comfort and healing aspect of Psalm 146, as opposed to what we just looked at in Psalm 31, that contrast I think is super important in thinking about trauma and lament.
Thank you. And now there's one question from again Reverend Dr. Jiva Ravela about the space that lament has to not just to deal with and to challenge the viruses that are health-wise, personal, but the social viruses like oppression and injustice. Do you see that happening, of course, in the lament literature that we have in the Hebrew Bible?
I'll answer that briefly, but also would welcome any comments from Reverend Dr. Premvardhan because of his specific context. I think that's absolutely the case. I mentioned this briefly that some of the language of social isolation, of social rejection. I'm the scorn of all my adversaries. People see me on the street and they flee from me. Psalm 22, people shake their heads at me and I are a direct scorn from me. That sense of oppression and social injustice, even beyond the pandemic, I think is particularly important. I'd like to see, and maybe you could help me in this regard, Dr. Premvardhan or Jiva, how, I guess my question would be, and I just don't know, how much have Dalit theologians picked up on the language of lament to speak to solidarity, to social injustice, to giving a vocabulary for rejection. I'm certainly aware of the ways in which the Gospels are invoked in this regard, but I'd be very curious to know to what extent the language of pain and rejection in the Psalms would be helpful for constructing a Dalit theology.
Reverend Premvardhan, you want to respond or you want me to respond to this?
Yes, a little small adding to this point. See, the Lament Psalms, actually, it is stated in the article, I forgot, enemies and the politics of the lament in the book of Psalms. It says that most of the Psalms of Lament, or it's kind of a loud practices. I mean, it was in a loud voice while they come to this Jerusalem temple, because of their addressing the issues which may cause to repent the enemies, those who are root cause of these all the evil things, and like those who are behind the scenes, who are making all the things of making the people to isolate. So in the laments, the author states that there is no address of enemies in the Psalms, which means they are not directly encountering to these oppressive and social injustice practices, but they are on that occasion they are addressing to God. They are submitting all the issues to God, which may cause to evoke the fear among the oppressors or those who are cause of social injustice. As well, they believe that God will respond to that injustice and He will make them to liberate from social injustice. So that was the theme of the laments.
Thank you. And talking about the songs as a source of Dalit theology, of course, we do have in the 80s the whole idea of wisdom literature, of course, not literature, sayings, proverbs, oral stories, and offstage comments. That when the landlord doesn't see us, we have certain language that which can be a source of Dalit theology. But none other than Dr. Joseph Prabhakar Dayam, in his doctoral study, has studied songs of those women, Dalit women who worked day after day under the sun, and while coping up with their struggles in the agricultural fields, they sang songs, which he proposes. And of course, he comes up with a theology of the cross, of the suffering, a Christology from there to say, yes, songs are valid, and of course not valid, more than valid, indispensable sources of Christian theology. And those songs, some of them express lament, And everything with lament expresses hope too. And it is between this lament and hope in those songs, he says there is life emerging and there is theology for us to learn from. To responding to your question, Dr. Adams. And now, one thing that Reverend Charles Freeman said is singing psalms. After all these laments are to be sung. And it is that part that if I'm watching right channels, now I hear, especially from India, more of praise than lament. Neither psalms from the past nor new songs about lament are there. For some reason, our cultures have stigmatized lament, which is proving to be a kind of liability in a situation like this. And after you respond to this, let's go and respond to Reverend Dr. Gosala or Prasad.
James, I just want to say one quick thing. I know we're running a little short on time, but just one of the reasons we have moved in this direction is, and I know this is quite popular in India as well as the United States, is the profound impact of the prosperity gospel. That everything that God will bless us with material blessings, and that if you just pray and believe hard enough, that it's a very superficial understanding of the gospel in many respects. But that what really counts. So there's no room for lament in some of those frameworks where you're only speaking of the ways in which God can reward you with concrete material earthly rewards. And there's no vocabulary for grief and suffering in this regard. I mean, there's not if I could be particularly provocative for a minute, even Reverend Premvardhan had mentioned this during Lent, when we do pay more attention to lament psalms. I would venture to say that Joel Osteen doesn't think about lament psalms ever in his preaching. And so I think that sort of tendency and trend has also led us in the direction of not engaging them all that well. So that's just a cultural factor that we have to acknowledge. There's a couple of other questions though.
Yeah. Now next to Dr. Gosala's question, can we say that the lament psalms also resonate the helplessness, hopeless situation of the people, which may ignite a sense of resistance, lament and resistance?
That's a really good question, and I will move to Psalm. I think we can that there is. I mean that we you look at you look at Psalm 22. The notion of just being completely isolated. The psalmist says, "I'm poured out like water. My heart is melted within me. There's a company of evildoers encircling me. My hands have shriveled." The sort of this idea of being completely isolated, but then God brings justice and righteousness, and God's faith in, trust in God is met with God's confidence and God's steadfast assurance. So I would jump forward to Psalm 146 in that regard, which is not, this is a praise psalm, but it's important in addressing Dr. Gosala's question of resistance to oppressing structures. The Lord sets the prisoners free. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the strangers. He upholds the orphan and the widow and brings the way of the wicked to ruin. We have to read lament psalms in conjunction with psalms of praise. They work together in the Psalter. The book of Psalms moves from the direction of lament to praise. So even as you feel the isolation of Psalm 22, it's important to remember in oppressive structures that the Lord watches over the strangers and upholds the widow and the orphan. That is a really timeless and important message in Scripture. I don't know if Dr. Premvardhan wants to speak to that one. So,
No, sir.
Okay. James, it looks like we have just a couple of other comments that we have some real history with Dr. Parker, and I think that's absolutely right. Thinking of the ways in which the sorrow songs during a particular traumatic and oppressive period in American history, the language of lament was certainly invoked then in a powerful and community building way. That I think is important, and that was during a period of trauma, particularly in the American South, when the vicious institution of slavery was predominant. So I think as we there's been a couple of questions about oppressive social structures in certain respects, and there's been some really interesting books that have come out in the last few years that have compared the situation of African Americans to the Dalit communities in India. So I think there's more work to be done. There's been some really, books that have gotten a lot of traction in that regard. So I think that's an excellent point. And we have, if I just want to reiterate something I said earlier, we have in our audience this morning some real experts in the Book of Psalms who have dealt and written about the Psalms all their scholarly and pastoral careers. So I'm grateful and honored that you joined the congregation today. But I'd also just say that there is a rich heritage. We got a comment from an alum. There's a rich heritage at Union Presbyterian Seminary. I've already mentioned Sib Towner, but Dr. James L. Mays, one of my predecessors at the seminary, was he spent most of his career dealing with the Psalms. How should they be preached? How should they be invoked? He said, I don't have the quote right in front of me. I think I can capture it more or less, but he said that the Psalms give us a framework for what it means to be human. They give us a vocabulary for lament and for hope. They give us a vocabulary for doubt and for trust. And they allow us, he said, they allow us to make distinctions between what we want and what we need. They just give us a language for approaching God and for approaching all that we have to face during our earthly days, even traumatic experiences like COVID and social oppression. That one of the things that Dr. Mays impressed was that we underutilize the Psalms, that we don't go to them enough in situations like this. And so one of the things I've tried to say is that this morning is that difficult passage texts are often the most useful, especially when we find a mixture of hopelessness and trust in the same text. And I think that's a situation we find ourselves in now. That's particularly a situation you find yourself in now, speaking to our brothers and sisters in India. And for a culture and a country that is so built on hospitality and fellowship and community, to be ravaged by this pandemic, which has led to a situation of hopelessness, of social isolation, and of disease. Our hearts, our prayers go out to you. We hope that you will stay in touch with us and tell us, keep us abreast of the situation. Tell us how we on the outside can be of help. And we long for the day when we can reconnect with you in person, and are so grateful to be able to do so on Zoom and on webinars like this, but just ongoing prayers for your situation and everybody everywhere as they face the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Adam. So I seem to have said what I wanted you to say, that a final word, a sentence. Reverend Premvardhan, do you want to add a word, a sentence, so that we can wrap up our session?
So the only word I could say that thank you for giving me such a great opportunity to be part in this wonderful discussion. And I'm very thankful to get enlightened with Samuel L. Adams, sir, for thought-provoking presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, friends who've been part of it, and especially for those who are creating resources, like Laura for creating an anthem, and those in India creating resources of lament. for those communities there. And thank you, colleagues, Dr. Adams and Reverend Premvardhan. And as always, it has been a rich experience. And Dr. Adams, every time I meet you, I learn something new, and this has been one of those moments. And my colleagues, keep checking and come back whenever you can, whenever we have these opportunities. And we do hope that we get to see you again soon. And meanwhile, let's not stop lamenting. Jesus wept. There is lament in New Testament. We lament because we hope, and let's not stop hoping. Till we meet again, thank you and bye.
Thank you all for joining us. Please be sure to come back tomorrow, Wednesday, May 26th at 9:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time or 12 p.m. Eastern Time for Wrestling with Race, Stories for American Anti-Racists from the South African Struggle with Dr. Alan Bosick. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day.